Good morning or afternoon or evening from wherever you may be joining us. As always, we begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which our four Australian campuses stand and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Welcome to the final webinar in the CGB's webinar series, New Ways of Seeing. It feels very nice and special to be introducing Professor Simon Restubog. Because I'm not only introducing a world-leading scholar in organizational behavior, but I'm also introducing my undergraduate honors supervisor, career mentor, colleague, and good friend. These days, Simon is a professor in the School of Labor and Employment Relations and Department of Psychology at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Prior to that, he held academic appointments at UNSW and ANU in Australia. So whereas most OB scholars were preoccupied with the sort of bright and sunny and teddy bear sort of side of what goes on in workplaces, Simon was more interested in the sinister stuff, like when companies break their promises or manipulative and Machiavellian types of people at work, or when bosses abuse their employees. And he developed a very productive program of research into this side of organizational behavior, which he has consistently published in the field's best journals. It is very hard to consistently publish in the sort of journals that Simon publishes his research in. Today, he's going to give us an overview of his program of research on abusive bosses. And in keeping with the general theme of 2020, we thought we'd also finish off our webinar series on a topic like this. I hope that's okay. I won't take up any more time. Please enjoy the presentation and do make use of the chat function if you have any questions. And we'll do our best to get to all of those at the end of the presentation. So that's all from me. And Simon, it's over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Kuyar, for that wonderful introduction. It's really a pleasure to be able to speak to you today from Urbana-Champaign, Illinois. It's 5:00 p.m. here, but as you can see, it's really dark outside. The sun set at 4:30. It's the start of our winter here in the US. It's currently 7 degrees here in Champaign. And I'm sure my colleagues, both in Australia and the Philippines, are experiencing somewhat very warm conditions. So before I actually start my presentation today, I would like to ask you to complete a very small task, okay? And this task would approximately take 1 minute of your time, okay? So in this task, I will ask you to complete a series of word fragments, okay? So try your very best to complete this task in 1 minute or less, right? And then what I'll do now is I'll flash the actual slide in which you're going to write a series of words based on this task. Okay, Kuyar, can you help me actually time them under 1 minute?
Sure.
Okay. All right. Okay, there you go. Your time starts now. So write as many words as you can under 1 minute or less. Time is up. Okay, pens down, please. Okay, just hold on to your answers, and I promise we will get back to this questionnaire later in my presentation. Okay, so here is the outline of my presentation. So in this presentation, I will first provide you a general overview of abuse supervision research. Again, abuse supervision is classified under a general umbrella called bullying. Okay, but I will focus primarily on this type of supervisory hostility. Okay, I will share with you the key findings in this research area, as well as from my own research program. More specifically, I will focus my attention on the drivers or the antecedents, as well as the consequences, not only for the victims or subordinates, but also for third parties as well. Okay. And then I will end my presentation by proposing several interventions and actionable strategies that could potentially mitigate the impact of supervisory abuse in organizations. So people often wonder, and I hear this all the time when I do my presentations in conferences or when I do my presentations in universities, both in Australia and the US. People ask me, why do you study abuse supervision? So this is a common trend I hear all the time, right? And my response to them is that I study abuse supervision because I consider it to be a silent epidemic, okay? And because it is a common occurrence in organizations worldwide. Okay, let's take a look at some of the statistics. In the United States, for example, the report of the Workplace Bullying Institute found that approximately 30 million American workers have been or bullied at work or are being bullied at work. And the report also suggests that a large proportion of these perpetrators, around 61%, are actually supervisors or managers. Okay? There are psychological and organizational consequences for supervisor-directed bullying or abuse supervision. Indeed, the research suggests that approximately 40 to 50% of these participants, or those who were targets of bullying, reported that their experience of bullying had a detrimental impact, not only on their health and well-being, but also in their work engagement and their work performance. In my adopted home, Australia, okay, where I actually lived for almost 20 years, okay, the Australian Bureau of Statistics estimates that approximately 395,000 workers have been exposed to long-term bullying at an estimated cost of $1,025 per worker per year. Okay, these financial costs may represent loss in productivity, increased psychological injury claims, stress leave, absenteeism, etc. Okay, but beyond these, empirical data and quantitative assessments, bullying or abusive supervision is personal to me, okay, and perhaps personal to many of you as well. And that, in a way, is my underlying motivation why I actually continue to study the dark side of human behavior in organizations. So let's have a look about how abusive supervision is defined in the research literature. So what is abusive supervision? So according to Tepper, in his seminal work published in Academy of Management Journal in 2000, abusive supervision is defined as subordinates' perceptions of the extent to which supervisors engage in a sustained display of hostile verbal, nonverbal behaviors, excluding physical contact. Now, within this definition, it's important to understand that there are three important features, okay, in this definition. One important feature here is that abusive supervision is considered to be a perception or a subjective assessment from the subordinate's perspective. Okay, being a perception or being highly perceptual, in other words, this assessment may actually be influenced by the subordinates or the observer's characteristics, as well as the context in which the assessment is being made. Another key feature of this definition is that abusive supervision captures this notion of continuous and consistent exposure to non-physical hostility. So in other words, there is continuing exposure to the supervisor's hostility over a period of time. So for example, a boss who had a bad day and takes it out on his or her employees by exploding or yelling at them would not automatically be considered as an abusive supervisor unless such behavior becomes a regular or consistent feature of the supervisor's behavioral repertoire. So it's important to consider here the consistency in which the behavior is actually being displayed by the supervisor directed towards the target. Now, a third feature of definition pertains to this notion that abusive supervision falls within the domain of willful behavior. So in other words, the supervisor who perpetrates this behavior has a purpose, okay? That is, the behavior itself is something which is voluntary, okay? And the supervisor consciously engages in the perpetration or in engaging in this particular behavior. So for example, abusive supervisors may mistreat or may victimize, may abuse their employees in order to elicit high levels of performance or to signify or to send a message to these subordinates that mistakes at work will not be tolerated. Now, another important note that I want to mention here, because we have also a number of academics attending this webinar, is that the features of abusive supervision is actually very distinct from other forms of workplace aggression. So first, how is it distinct? First, abusive supervision is exclusively focusing on downward hostility. So in other words, this is the relationship or the aggression or the hostility directed from the supervisor as the perpetrator to a target who is the subordinate. Unlike other aggressive behaviors such as hostility directed upward, where a bunch of subordinates aggressing towards their supervisor, which you call upward bullying or upward abuse. Or abuse may also occur laterally, where a coworker victimizes or abuses or bullies another coworker, which we term as lateral bullying or lateral abuse. Second, when we speak about abuse supervision, we only focus on non-physical hostility as opposed to other behavioral forms such as victimization, which include physical aggression, or generalized hierarchical abuse such as sexual harassment. So when we talk about abuse supervision, we only focus on non-physical hostility. It captures both verbal and non-verbal behaviors, excluding physical contact. So that basically refers to the boundary parameters or the theoretical parameters of this specific behavior. Okay. By the way, feel free to actually ask me a question. I know we do have a chat box here, so if you have any clarifications or questions, then feel free to actually write your responses. Okay, I think we already have one. Can you read it, Kliar, from your end?
Oh, that was just Shahab just informing the participants to use the chat function.
Okay, no worries. So let's look at some behavioral exemplars. So how is abusive supervision actually exemplified behaviorally? Okay, so there are a number of concepts or behavioral exemplars that have been used to describe an abusive supervisor. So first, an abusive supervisor is considered to be a constant critic. So in other words, this individual or this supervisor uses insulting and belittling comments and engages in a lot of name calling, constantly, consistently harasses, questions, criticizes a target or a victim about his or her incompetence. And an abusive supervisor also shows aggressive nonverbal behaviors in the way they actually look or behave towards a target or a subordinate. Okay. Another behavioral exemplar of an abusive supervisor is that they are described as what you call a screaming Mimi. In other words, they yell, they scream, they curse, they make a lot of these loud, angry outbursts and tantrums, intimidating the target or the subordinate by slamming things, slamming the door, or throwing objects at them. Okay. An abusive supervisor is also referred to as a two-headed snake. Okay, so what does an abusive supervisor do? They actually deny the subordinate or the target the resources that they need in order to do their work or in order to function at work. They also assign them meaningless tasks or meaningless work as a form of punishment. And finally, an abusive supervisor is described as a gatekeeper. In other words, this individual isolates the victim, ignores the victim by engaging in what you call silent treatment, deliberately cuts out the communication loop, but still expect, the subordinate or the target to perform and to have the missing information. So by now, you probably have recalled your previous experiences, whether you actually work with a supervisor like this, demonstrating these kind of behaviors. So what I've done here is, I've done research on abuse supervision for over 10 years now, and I believe that a systematic way of actually looking at abuse supervision is by taking a systems perspective, okay, in my research. So a systems perspective here means that I conceive of abuse supervision as a phenomenon that actually is influenced by multiple factors. So in other words, abuse supervision does not originate from a vacuum. These abusive behaviors or these forms of hostility are a byproduct of multiple factors. Okay. In other words, in order for us to better understand the phenomenon of interest here, we need to closely examine the interactive forces of the context in which the abuse actually takes place, okay? The perpetrator, in this case, the supervisor, and the subordinate, or in this case, the target of the abuse. So first, it's important for us to examine the context, which captures the organizational structures, the organizational practices, the organizational climate, and the ongoing changes occurring in the organization. So how does the context actually shape supervisory hostility? Second, we also need to look at the characteristics, the attributes, and the experience of the leader, okay? So here, I will be able to talk about, for example, the characteristics of the leader, the experience of the leader from within the organization and outside the organization. And third, we need to look at the characteristics of the subordinate. Okay? Remember, as per my definition offered by Tepper, abuse of supervision is based on subordinates' perceptions. And as such, okay, their reactions are likely to be shaped by their own personality, their own emotions, and their thought patterns, okay? And looking at this entire framework, of course, there are enablers or factors that happens within the work environment or characteristics both of the perpetrator or the subordinate that could either mitigate, right, or aggravate the experience of abuse or the consequence of abuse, okay? Part of this framework is also understanding what are some of the mechanisms or measures that organizations can implement or deploy to minimize the occurrence of abuse. And if abuse does take place, what can organizations do to remediate it, okay? So in the subsequent slides, what I'm going to show you now is I'm going to walk you through the framework that I've developed in terms of understanding, the systems approach of abuse supervision. So first, let's take a look at what are the contextual factors. So in other words, what are the contextual drivers? What are the factors within the environment that could potentially shape, okay, the presence or the development of these hostile behaviors, okay, demonstrated by supervisors, okay? We know from like social learning theory, social information processing theory, a lot of theories in management that employees observe and model the behaviors, the attitudes, the emotional reactions of others in learning what behaviors and attitudes are considered to be acceptable within an organization, okay? So Bandura, for example, in a number of social learning theories argue that organizations characterized by an aggressive or a hostile work culture, a culture which reward employees for being competitive, confrontational, and negative, okay? These types of cultures or climates actually facilitate abuse of power and non-productive competition. So I'm not saying here that competition is bad. All I'm saying here is that if the competition that actually occurs within the organization becomes non-productive non-productive or counterproductive at that, it can actually lead to devastating consequences for employees and organizations. So in other words, what theory is telling us, and there is a lot of empirical evidence to support this, is that bad behavior in the organization can lead to bad behavior by individuals. Okay? And our research actually does support this proposition. So for example, we know from empirical evidence that supervisors who have experienced unfavorable treatment from their own organization or their own immediate supervisors may actually redirect their anger and frustration onto their subordinates, okay? And this process is consistent with the notion of what you call displaced aggression, okay? Where an individual is unwilling to retaliate against a source of the mistreatment, in this case, the supervisor or the manager, okay? Because they're afraid of unwanted consequences or the retaliation is likely to happen if they retaliate towards the source of the mistreatment, and instead redirect or choose to mistreat or abuse less powerful or less threatening targets. And this is an established finding in the management and psychological literature that supervisors engage in abuse or direct their frustration by engaging in abuse supervision because they themselves were experiencing injustice at work, either from their organization or from their own supervisors or managers. Another key question that I'm interested to answer here is that what are those person factors that may contribute to supervisor abuse? So when we talk about person factors here, I'd like to focus on two types. So person factors associated with a supervisor and person factors associated with a subordinate. Okay, so let me first talk about what are the person factors associated with subordinate. Okay, so research evidence has consistently shown that there are a number of subordinate related factors or drivers that may actually lead to abuse supervision. So in this research, what they do is they collect data from the subordinates, and they also collect in terms of their characteristics, and they also collect data from the supervisors, in terms of the supervisors in terms of their characteristics, and collect data from the subordinates in terms of rating whether their supervisor engaged in abuse supervision. So in relation to subordinate related factors, they found a number of person-related factors associated with the subordinate, okay? And these results are actually in line with criminological research. So for example, the victim precipitation perspective, this is a common perspective used in criminology, okay, argues that, some individuals may become at risk of being abused or victimized by eliciting, often unconsciously, the hostility of their perpetrators. So what does that mean exactly? So subordinates with certain personality characteristics or engages in certain behaviors are more likely at risk of being abused. So evidence, for example, suggests that employees who are underperformers, employees who tend to be reserved, quiet, introverted, or lack self-confidence or social skills are more prone to be abused by their supervisors. Okay? Now, there's also research that suggests that subordinates who are characterized with high levels of neuroticism. So individuals, for example, with high levels of neuroticism tend to behave with anxiety, impulsivity, hostility, and vulnerability, okay? Evidence suggests that individuals with high neuroticism are unlikely to defend themselves against the mistreatment of their supervisors, okay? Supervisors also are likely to perceive subordinates or individuals with high neuroticism as bad apples. They're downers, okay? Because they drag down the positivity that actually occurs in the group. And as a result, these individuals are more likely to be targets of abuse or victimization. Okay? Now, studies have also shown that some individuals are prone to interpreting others' behavior as hostile, even when it is not, okay? And this is what we call hostile attribution bias, okay? So social psychological research suggests that individuals with high levels of hostile attribution bias may perceive any form of supervisory action as negative or threatening, even if the supervisor is not abusive. But given that a subordinate or an employee will have this hostile attribution bias, they always regard supervisory actions as something negative or threatening in their own cognitive perspective. Okay. So let's now look at some person-related drivers coming from the supervisor. So a number of empirical studies have also identified certain supervisor-related characteristics or features, personality profiles that might actually predispose them towards abusive or hostile behaviors. So what does the research say? Okay, so the research suggests that supervisors engage in these hostile acts when they are unable to self-regulate. So in other words, when they are unable to regulate their emotions, their behaviors, their cognitions. And this usually happens, okay, when they are exposed to high levels of stress as a result of intense work pressures, when they have exceedingly difficult work goals, when they're actually exposed to difficult tasks, and when they have interpersonal conflicts with their coworkers or with their own supervisors, okay? our own research, in fact, Kuyar is my co-author in one of these papers published, I think, in 2011 and 2012, looks at personality characteristics of supervisors. And what we found is that supervisors who are Machiavellian, or those who tend to be manipulative or exploit others in order to maximize their personal gains or their self-interest, are more likely to behave in a manner that subordinates construe as abusive. Okay, more recently, actually, no, not recently, because this has been published in the last 7 to 8 years, my colleagues and I also presented the idea that it's possible that non-work factors or the personal baggage of a supervisor may also contribute to abusive supervision. Okay, so 2 of our projects actually look at, one paper looks at the supervisor experience before the age of 18 years old. And we found that prior to the age of 18 years old, if they were exposed to a highly punitive family environment, when they experienced family undermining or verbal abuse from their own parents, or merely observing their parents fight, which we refer to as interparental aggression, socializes these supervisors to think and to feel in a hostile way, which in turn results in the likelihood to engage in hostile acts as perceived by subordinates. So a lot of the research in abusive supervision focuses primarily on work-related factors. But what the research has failed to identify is that are there factors outside the work environment that may actually explain why supervisors are abusive in the first place. So for these 2 studies that we did on family history, so one paper was published in Leadership Quarterly, and another paper was published in Journal of Applied Psychology. What we did there is that we demonstrated that these family history variables actually predicted abusive supervision over and above the contribution of prior conceptual explanations. So in other words, we measured family history from the perspective of the supervisor. We confirmed that and tested its veracity by collecting data from the siblings of the supervisor as well as from the parents of the supervisor. And we ran a series of regressions to test whether family history operationalized, whether it's, experience abuse from their own family environments or vicarious learning by observing their parents fight, predictive abusive supervision over and above the contribution of justice. For example, when supervisor experience injustice, mistreatment, controlling also for the personality characteristics of the supervisors, right? And our evidence found that in a series of studies, so one paper had 3 studies replicating over 2 different countries, and another study has 4 independent studies replicated multiple times in several countries as well. We found consistent evidence that family history does predict abusive supervision over and above the contribution of prior explanations. Okay, so that is a very robust finding. Okay, so moving on, part of the systems perspective framework here, what are the consequences of abusive supervision? Now, I need to highlight here that abusive supervision does not only have negative repercussions at work, okay? Lots and emerging evidence consistently actually find that the effects of abuse supervision actually transcend beyond work, that there are non-work-related outcomes emanating from abuse. And let's try to review some of these outcomes. So in terms of work-related outcomes, there is already consistent evidence and there are already 2 meta-analytic studies done in this area that demonstrated that abusive supervision or individuals who experience abuse compared to their non-abuse counterparts, okay, subordinates who perceive abuse, okay, from their supervisors reported being less satisfied with their jobs, less committed to their organization, less trusting towards others. They experience higher levels of psychological distress. They perform poorly at work and are less likely to perform helping behaviors that contribute to organizational effectiveness. Okay. In our recent research that we did, and again, we were able to replicate this over 4 samples in different organizations, we also found that repeated exposure to abuse, okay, create this feeling of fear among subordinates. Okay, Fear intensifies the desire to engage in employee silence. So that is, employees are not likely to speak up or engage with the supervisor because they fear that they may actually experience or they may actually damage the relationship with their supervisor. And in doing so, not speaking up actually triggers an escalating conflict that only invites further abuse. Okay, so what this research actually tells us that if you already experienced bullying from your supervisor, already experiencing, problems or hostility from your supervisor, and you decide not to speak up, it is actually worse because it will invite further abuse down the track. Now, the effects of abusive supervision outside work have also been extensively documented. So, for example, there is research showing that abusive supervision spills over in one's personal and family life. Okay, so for example, there was a paper in Human Relations published like 10 years ago that demonstrates that people who experience abuse from their supervisors engage in dysfunctional coping, okay, such as overexposure to alcohol and smoking and drugs. Okay, there's also research showing that abusive supervision may actually lead to lack of sleep or insomnia, as reported by their spouses. Why is that so? So a target or a subordinate who experience abuse will cognitively ruminate about their experiences, and in doing so, will make it difficult for them to sleep, or may even lead to insomniac reactions. Okay. There is also research evidence showing that as victims of abuse, subordinates are frustrated. And when the perpetrator is one's boss, employees are not likely to fight back. So they will not retaliate directly to the source of the mistreatment. So rather than confronting their own bosses who are abusive, subordinates may exert their aggression or redirect their anger or frustration to less powerful targets, such as their family members or their spouses. So for example, this research, these two studies, for example, found the ramifications of abuse supervision in terms of partner undermining, okay, as reported by the spouse. Okay, so in this project, you can look at, for example, comparing the high levels of exposure and low levels of exposure to abuse supervision. You can see that subordinates who actually had high levels of exposure to abuse supervision led to higher levels of greater levels of undermining as reported by their spouse or their partner. Similarly, subordinates who experience high levels of abuse supervision also reported higher levels of insomnia as reported by their spouse. Okay, these are not self-reports. Okay, these are reports, independent reports provided by their partners or their spouses. So the next question to ask is that what can actually mitigate or enable or aggravate the occurrence of abuse at work? And if abuse does occur or happen, what are the enablers or the factors that can make the consequences even more destructive or worse? Okay. So again, we go back to certain contextual conditions. So there are contextual conditions or situational factors in organizations that can aggravate the occurrence of abuse at work. So supervisory abuse is likely to be aggravated or take place in conditions or situations in which it's high stake, in which there are high levels of uncertainty, there are high levels of pressure and anxiety, such as downsizing, performance management reviews, and higher economic hardship. So these situational factors can actually aggravate the occurrence of abuse, and it could also worsen the consequences experienced by their subordinates. Similarly, there is emerging evidence telling us that workplace characteristics or the organizational structure can actually strengthen the impact of abuse on these negative consequences. So for example, if you work in an organization where there is a greater proportion of minority groups or employees, okay? So that can actually strengthen the relationship between abuse and its negative outcomes. the impact of abuse on negative outcomes is also pronounced or aggravated when the organizational structure is centralized as opposed to decentralized. I've already talked about how intense work pressure can actually aggravate the impact of abuse on workers. So now we go to the practical question in relation to abuse supervision research. Are there any preventive measures, or are there like strategies, actionable strategies that organizations, individuals, and supervisors that they could consider in order to mitigate abuse at work? So the answer to that question is absolutely. There are a number of preventive measures and strategies, actionable recommendations that can buffer or that can mitigate the impact of abuse at work. And let's try to review some of these recommendations. Okay, and I'd like to group these recommendations and classify them in terms of preventive and remediation-based strategies. Okay, so first, okay, and I'm sure a lot of management scholars and, because we have a number of consultants also and public sector employees and leaders and managers attending this webinar. So it's a no-brainer that developing a zero tolerance organizational culture in terms of abuse is imperative. Okay, in order for, of course, to engender this zero tolerance for bullying, okay, it's important that we actually increase the general awareness of what is involved and to clarify what is actually meant by appropriate work behaviors. So there are important several core issues that needs to be addressed here when such policy is actually developed, conceptualized, and implemented in an organization. So first, it's important for us to understand that it has to be an explicit and a precise communication policy that the organization will commit to a bullying-free environment. And part of making that commitment is being able to define exactly and precisely what kind of behaviors that are regarded as bullying. Okay, what are the behavioral exemplars or the specific behaviors in order to be classified as bullying? What is considered to be bullying? What is considered to be not bullying? Together with a statement of the consequences of breaching, for example, these organizational standards. It is also important to clarify the responsibility expected from the various people involved. Identifying, for example, who should be the first point person to be contacted if an employee or a subordinate, for example, has been bullied or experienced bullying. Okay, what are the responsibilities of these individuals? Okay, are these things supposed to be communicated verbally? Should there be like a written form of communication to be able to like jot down like as a form of a critical incident about what actually happened? It is also imperative that we explain the procedures involved for making and investigating such complaints. Okay. But most importantly, what we need to consider here is how was a policy actually developed or conceptualized? So researchers, okay, both in management and strategy would recommend the importance of incorporating input, okay, originating from staff members across all levels of the organizational hierarchy, including union representatives, because there should be broad involvement is needed in order to emphasize the status of the process, as well as to increase the awareness and acceptance throughout the organization. Okay. Another preventive strategy that has been found to be effective is by conducting climate surveys. Okay. So we know from research that climate surveys are effective and are beneficial in numerous ways. So for example, it provides upward feedback to top management on critical issues that is of importance or that matters to the staff. You can also use survey data in evaluating and improving organizational programs and practices. However, a key issue that we want to address here is this. And we know this not only in US organizations, but also in Australian organizations, that organizations conduct climate surveys every year. But the key question to ask here is that, are organizations really using the climate survey data to improve their practices and processes? Or is it just a regular thing that we ask our staff to do? Okay, so this is something that we need to consider, because we need to look at the evidence and how this data actually inform organizational practices and organizational processes. So to what extent do we actually utilize this data in actually informing, improving, and evaluating our systems and practices? And finally, we have leader selection. Okay, so as an organizational psychologist, okay, I believe that the best way to curb supervisory abuse is by ensuring that bullies do not get assigned or do not get promoted in leadership positions. Okay, and as such, leader selection is imperative. Okay, I know in Australia, a lot of public service organizations, I think that's true for both public service organizations and also private organizations, is that a lot of these leaders, go through a series of selection, like they administered a bunch of psychometric tests, personality tests, et cetera, doing behavioral interviews. However, these personality assessments have inherent limitations or constraints. So for example, most of these personality tests have high rates of fakeability. Okay, impression management, especially for intelligent test takers who are very familiar about what is actually being assessed. Okay, so there's already a number of advances in personality assessment that would enable, okay, HR consultants, HR practitioners to be able to capture or tap the unconscious aspect of one's personality that are not often captured by these personality assessments. Okay, so perhaps some of these advancements in personality assessments can be embedded as part of the selection system when you are actually evaluating or selecting future leaders in your organizations. Okay, and then finally, you have remediation strategies. So apart from employee assistance programs through counseling, mediation has also been proposed or suggested as an effective strategy in managing the effects of abuse at work. However, there is emerging evidence telling us that mediation is not as effective as it was proposed for two primary reasons. Okay, first, there is a power imbalance between the abusive supervisor and the subordinate. And even if mediation takes place and that subordinate or target continues to work under the supervision of that supervisor, I betcha abuse will continue to take place or happen. Okay. A second reason why mediation is not effective is because mediation tends to focus on the behavior rather than the drivers or the antecedents of the behavior. So you only focus on the behavior which is actually observable, but mediation does not actually rectify the cognitions, the emotions, the personality characteristics, the personality styles of the abusive supervisor. As I indicated a while ago, there are advancements in personality assessment that can allow you to capture this unconscious side of one's personality. And this assessment tool was developed by James from Georgia Tech University, and it captures an implicit test which captures an individual's personality characteristics. Now, when you look at the specific test, it appears to be a test assessing verbal reasoning or reading comprehension, but the test actually measures the predisposition of an individual to aggress, okay, or to engage in hostile acts. This assessment tool also can predict the individual's likelihood to engage in hostile behavior by uncovering their justification mechanisms or people's justification why they're actually engaging in these hostile behaviors. Okay, remember before I actually started my presentation, I actually gave you this task to complete, right? This is a 1-minute task, but the actual task, would usually take 3 minutes to complete. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to go through this task that I've given you. So this is what you call a word completion task, okay? Similar to the conditional reasoning test, this is a series of word completion word fragments, okay? So this is presented as a series of words that participants have to complete, okay? And again, it is seen as a verbal comprehension or a verbal ability task. But what it actually measures is the presence of aggressive concepts in your memory. So what this task actually does is that it calculates the number of words you have completed. It calculates the number of aggressive words that you created. You now add up the number of aggressive words divided by the number of words created, and that becomes the overall score, or the score that captures the presence of aggressive concepts in your memory. The higher the score means the greater the presence of aggressive concepts in your memory. Now, why is that relevant? So in our research, what we found is that supervisors, okay, with higher levels of aggressive concepts in their memory are more likely to be perceived as abusive by their subordinate. And again, this is what we call an implicit test. So this test cannot actually be faked. It cannot be manipulated. Okay? That's why these are advancements in personality assessment that captures, the presence of aggressive concepts in one's memory by presenting them a series of words or a series of sentences that they need to complete, and whether those words are associated with aggression. Okay, so this research evidence provides us, tells us that one's hostility or the presence of these concepts in one's memory are possibly associated to the likelihood that the supervisor will engage in hostile acts as perceived by their subordinate. So in addition to organizational interventions, there are also individual-based interventions that can be deployed or that can be utilized, okay, by organizations. So for example, leader coaching. Okay? Leader coaching has numerous benefits in terms of improving performance, increasing efficiency and effectiveness, achieving work-related goals, or improving communication skills, okay? And having a coach is also very beneficial, okay? So back in Australia, when I was at ANU, I was deputy director for research. My head of school was very generous in providing me a coach / a mentor outside the university, and that mentor sort of became my sounding board, right? It was also an opportunity for me to bounce ideas in terms of policies or strategies that I can utilize to expand research opportunities for faculty in my department. And at the same time, it became an opportunity for me to vent negative emotions from my unpleasant work environment, right? So having that individual, that coach outside the organization, I know at University of Australia, a colleague of mine there who used to be dean would have appointed coaches, to support the personal development of the head of schools within her college or within her faculty. Right? And again, there is experimental evidence that demonstrates that coaching can actually considerably reduce stress and enhance well-being. Now, another strategy here is by using leader development training. Okay? Now, there is tons of evidence showing the effectiveness of leadership development training in terms of motivating employees, offering them rewards, helping them develop vision. However, most of these programs tend to ignore the reality, okay, that emotions play a salient part in supervisor-subordinate interactions. I see Herman is here who does research on leader emotions. So Herman, please feel free to chime in, given your research expertise, right? So these are vital components that should be integrated in leadership development training. Now, there is one particular research done by a social psychologist, Professor Adam Galinsky from Columbia University Business School. And he found that when leaders, when they feel powerful, okay, when they actually have the sense of power within them, their perspective-taking abilities are downgraded. Okay, so the more powerful we feel, as he argued, the more we anchor in our own perspective rather than adjusting to the perspective of others. Okay, so that was one of the key findings in his research, and he demonstrated this through experimental evidence. Okay, he also suggests that by briefly reducing our sense of power, okay, by thinking about, for example, the current state of another person, say, for example, thinking that, oh, maybe, okay, this employee is having a difficult time, or maybe, you know, this employee is having a lot of personal or family problems, it can actually help increase the acuity or the precision of our perspective taking, which in turn can make us better and effective leaders. Okay. So I mentioned here the term perspective taking, and I know we have a number of counseling psychologists here, probably coaches, okay, in this webinar. Now, there is a distinction between perspective taking and empathy. You know, perspective taking here sounds like empathy, but the two interpersonal qualities are actually siblings rather than identical twins. So when we talk about empathy here, it is one's ability to understand the emotional state of another person, which is, of course, an essential human quality. Okay, but research has shown that especially in commercial settings, in organizational contexts, understanding the other side's thoughts and interests and perspective, not simply their own emotions and feelings, can be more effective in forging a deal. So this usually happens when you do negotiation, right? So if you are exposed in a high-stake leadership situation, definitely it is important to be emotionally intelligent. But in addition to that, use your head as much as your heart. Okay? And finally, another individual-focused intervention that has been found to be effective is through emotional regulation. Okay? So managing one's emotions by anticipating hot emotions. Okay? And I usually do this when I supervise my students or when I do consulting projects or when I do research projects for organizations. You know, if my expectations have not been met, so of course I get angry. Of course, the natural reaction is to shout or to yell at my students, you know, helping me manage a data collection process. So how do I manage that? So through emotional regulation strategies, there are practical strategies that you can utilize. Write your thoughts. Count from 1 to 20. By doing these practical strategies, it actually helps you to calm down. One time I remember, again, I was still in Australia in ANU, this was back in 2016, and I was really, really frustrated with my head of school because I was not consulted about a research policy that was being implemented in terms of promotion, right? And I was really, really angry. And of course, you know, I could have just certainly blurted out to my head of school and my department chair about what I was feeling because we often have like weekly meetings. But what I did was I wrote down exactly how I felt. And then I read it the following day. And I decided not to send that email, right? So in other words, by having that, by being able to write your thoughts and count down and reflect, right? Or talk to people, as simple as just letting it all out, venting it all out, that will actually help you regulate your emotions. Now, social psychologists have also proposed that they may actually have a formula in terms of how you react to workplace events. Now, the traditional formula is that there is an event that actually happens, a negative event. People react negatively to a negative event. And then, of course, the outcome becomes worse. What social psychology is actually suggesting is that perhaps rather than reacting to the event, react to the outcome. So if there was a negative event, if you want the outcome to actually be favorable, you react to that outcome. So what specific reactions or behavioral responses should you engage in order to have that favorable outcome? And finally, to demonstrate that effect, in one of our studies, we looked at how self-regulatory capabilities are able to mitigate the impact of your prior experiences and abuse supervision. So in this research, we looked at the characteristics of leaders. So when leaders are actually exposed to a punitive home environment, when they actually experience family undermining, which we know can lead to abusive supervision. Okay? So what are the factors that can mitigate that? So in this research, we found that leaders or supervisors with high levels of self-control or self-regulation can buffer or can mitigate the impact of prior negative experience at home. And we were able to demonstrate this in 2 empirical studies. Okay? In study 1, we collected data from supervisor-subordinate dyads. So we asked the supervisors to reflect back on their experience in the past prior to the age of 18 and rate the extent to which they have experienced family undermining in their respective home environments. And then we asked subordinates to report abusive supervision from their leaders. And what did they find? What did we find? We actually found that there was a negative relationship, a weaker positive relationship between previous experience of family undermining and abusive supervision reported by subordinate for those leaders, okay, with high levels of self-control. And the relationship between experience of undermining and abuse supervision was actually stronger and positive when the supervisor has low levels of self-control. So this is one of the evidence that demonstrates about the power of self-regulation. Now, we tried to replicate this study using triads. So in other words, we collected data from the supervisor, we collected data from the sibling of the supervisor, and we also collected data from the subordinates of the supervisor. So in this study, the siblings provided ratings of the extent to which the supervisor, their sibling, prior to the age of 18, experienced family undermining. We collected data from supervisors to rate their levels of self-control, and we asked subordinates to rate their perceptions of abusive supervision. So as you can see, okay, in this study replicates the previous study where we collected supervisor-subordinate dyads. So as you can see, there was a stronger positive association between siblings' reports of the experience of previous undermining of the leader and the leader's subordinates' perceptions of abusive supervision, especially when the leader has low levels of self-control. And in contrast, the relationship between family undermining as reported by the sibling of the leader and abusive supervision as reported by the subordinate, there was a weaker relationship. As you can see, this flat line here representing high levels of self-control. So the likelihood that leaders who experience undermining as reported by their siblings is actually weaker when the leader has high levels of self-control. So with that, I hope you enjoyed that presentation, providing you, a preview of abuse supervision research, identifying incidents and consequences, and what practical interventions can be used to mitigate these effects. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simon. That was awesome. Very, very insightful. And thanks for sharing your 10 years of research experience and expertise in this area. We've got a bunch of questions. Yeah, sure. Yeah. So some are conceptual, some are methodological, others are practice focused. I've tried to sort of categorize them
together.
Yeah. So actually, the first two is sort of questioning the conceptual boundaries of abusive supervision and how it's different from, say, broader constructs of destructive leadership and even bullying. So if you want to just comment on that very quickly.
So to be honest with you, so this is one of the key issues that a lot of dark side OB scholars have been grappling with, right? So there's, for example, like a conceptual piece written by Hershkovich and published in the Journal of Organizational Behavior, where she argued that a lot of these constructs tend to be overlapping with one another, right? Because they don't seem to cite one another. For example, the bullying literature do not cite the abusive supervision literature. In the same fashion, the abuse supervision literature does not cite, the bullying literature. And now there is research looking at destructive leadership, right? I think the key concept of destructive leadership has been published in the Leadership Quarterly. But within the destructive leadership, what they're saying there is that destructive leadership should actually be considered as a general umbrella, right, in which you have different workplace aggression concepts. And even some scholars, for example, even question whether destructive leadership should be treated as a general umbrella, or perhaps destructive leadership can be classified under the rubric of workplace aggression. So I completely empathize with you in terms of this is, a theoretical quandary in the field of organizational behavior. So more recently, my team and I here at the University of Illinois, led by Professor Dan Newman from the psychology department, has tried to actually do a content analysis of all these leadership behaviors: destructive leadership, incivility, abusive supervision. So we are now in the process of developing a three-pronged conceptualization of these behaviors. So rather than actually label them as destructive leadership, abusive supervision, social undermining, workplace incivility, workplace aggression, rather than using these labels, we'd rather look at them in terms of the behavioral content. So we are now in the process of collecting data. So this data collection involves presenting to our participants a list of these behaviors, a total of 100 of them, right? And then we are now in the process of classifying them, categorizing them, okay, using confirmatory factor analysis and a number of analytical tools, and group them into behavioral categories. So for example, again, this is just preliminary. One of the behavioral category we came up with is belittling and putting down, right? So if you look at a lot of the items, for example, in destructive leadership, in incivility, abuse supervision, you can identify specific items there that reflect or that in a way signify belittling or putting down, right? So we classify now those behaviors under the behavioral label belittling or putting down. So I think this is now the trajectory, and I think this is now the direction where the dark side OB researchers should go into. Rather than developing new constructs, I think it's now high time to look at the actual behavioral content as opposed to the labels or constructs.
Yeah,
I hope I was able to
just add a really quick point. I think definitely, Simon, you're absolutely right. I think in the leadership research, we have already called for not expanding the research domains and more variables. We want to do the reduction. Rather than proliferation, we want to consolidate or unify the literature to make sure down to the earth, there may be only a couple of major behaviors and pretty much classify good leadership and bad leadership and good side or dark side, or that's it. But I think that's a very good attempt. Thank you.
And in fact, even in leadership correlate, for example, in leadership research, they try to avoid dichotomizing leadership.
That's right.
Right? Whether is it constructive, is it destructive? Now, the other thing to consider is that some researchers, for example, do not even consider abusive supervision as destructive leadership. Right? Is abusive supervision a form of leadership? Again, these are some burning issues that need to be addressed by the dark side OB scholar community.
Absolutely.
Very good. Chris has a number of comments
Sure.
throughout the chat. Chris, if you're still there and listening, feel free to, if you want to actually engage in a discussion rather than going through your written questions, just you can raise your hand, and
please,
I
Chris.
think you
Yes.
might have done that already. Okay. Oh, yeah.
Okay. Hi, Chris.
Hi, Chris.
Hi. I found your conversation so relevant. It also triggered quite a few memories of past work experiences. Certainly having had some very detrimental impacts on me personally, as well as so many other people. And I think one of the challenges when you're looking at supervisors who are not, there's no consequences for them, even at the highest levels. Yes. I worked in government for quite a long time, and I also worked in not-for-profits and volunteer organisations. And the higher up the food chain it goes, sometimes those behaviours get worse, that it's almost a preconceived, kind of acceptable behaviour, or you know, when you're looking at the impacts it has on actual workers on the ground, and these supervisors or future leaders, you know, are sort of touted and protected. And it's almost like you become a, there's a word, I can't quite get my tongue around it at the moment, but, you know, you just become a casualty. It's much easier whether you end up, you know, going to the employee assistance schemes and trying to get some counselling for yourself, because at the end of the day, the only thing that worked for me was how I changed the way that I responded to the behaviour. It didn't change their behaviour, and I've got friends even now currently going through some pretty horrendous stuff, you know, that even ends up in the court situation where, you know, the people that just feel, and I know that, you know, the big word perception is always a challenge,
Yes.
whether it's your own personal one or how even a supervisor perceives the way that they're behaving. But, you know, for me, I've always been the advocate to speak up and stand up when you see people who are not being treated appropriately. You know, I've reviewed and helped to write policies, procedures, do training in regards to code of conduct. I don't know how many personality assessments and analysis that I've personally been through, but also within different work environments that I've worked in. And at the end of the day, nothing changes. You know, their behaviours don't actually change. They might end up sort of, you know, going a little bit silent for a little while, but then they have very different coercive ways of coming back to what they do. But I think the one point that really resonates with me in regard to what you've talked about today is in regard to the family situation. There is a lot of pressure on some people to achieve, depending on their socioeconomics and all that kind of stuff. And I think that certainly does flow through to how they feel that, you know, when they're in a power of position or control, you know, that they can then go lord it over other people. And the same for younger people who are subjected to bullying from a very young age, whether that's within the family, going to school, what have you. I'm working with some young people at the moment down in Melbourne who have set up their own support group to sort of talk about and deal with bullying, but also to reach out to other young people, because how you react to that when you're younger has a huge impact when you're faced with those similar situations in a workplace. And I guess a couple of the comments that I've put in the chat box there relate to the ILO Convention 190 on harassment and violence in the workplace.
Yes.
Now, I belong to a non-government organisation that works really hard, particularly around elimination of all forms of violence. And we lobbied the Australian government to ratify that particular convention back in August, and they haven't. And we haven't had any formal feedback from the powers that be yet. But one of the excuses was, oh, there's too many workplace health and safety related issues in this. And it's like, you know, your research is really valuable and important. From my observations and connections globally, it is a global issue. It's not just unique to one place or another. The Australian Human Rights Commission also issued their latest national survey on harassment and violence in the workplace. It's escalated, and particularly under COVID-19, that's become increasingly more difficult. So I'll put a couple of posts in the web link there for others if they might like to have a read of some of that stuff. But, you know, we all know that when you have a fantastic leader and someone who you feel listens to you in a workplace, you will excel. You will give that 150% time and time again. And I agree with some of your observations around workplace pressures, even those imposed on supervisors. So when you sort of try to separate the individual behaviour from some of the actual activity that's happening around it, it is that cascading effect. But
absolutely, I agree with you, Chris, because like if you look at work pressures, for example, that actually occurs from the top and it cascades down the bottom.
Yep.
bottom line is that the subordinates are the one that's actually directly affected, because the boss is just imposing on these, for example, production or this high levels of performance, because they're also being pressured by their own bosses, right? So it's just a cycle that never ends. So, and you need to actually cut that cycle.
And I think, you know, for me,
that cycle from occurring. Yes.
When the last sort of horrendous experience I had, you know, it sort of threw it back into like a domestic violence situation within the workplace, where you are just sitting there listening to somebody ranting and getting quite aggressive in the way that they're communicating some of these things. And you just, you know, for some of us, the only option is to leave. And others that don't have that choice just simply tolerate it and say nothing. And that affects their whole self-esteem, purpose, and any opportunities that they might look to seek for promotion too. You know, it's the old word of mouth stuff that goes along. And I found in my experience that the HR people were very aware of it, sometimes even subjected to it themselves, but they were useless in being able to seriously put in some intervention there around consequences. And the behaviours just continued, you know, and
especially, Chris, if the perpetrator, for example, belongs in the executive or in the higher ups, it will be very difficult for HR to actually intervene. That's why what I'm saying here is that it has to be a culture change. And there should be like a zero tolerance policy in relation to bullying that has to be implemented consistently across levels of the organization.
I think zero tolerance is such a motherhood statement in so many ways. I mean, most of us, if you come from that perspective around social justice and human rights, it's like you don't want to ever see anybody subjected to this kind of stuff. And your own personal values kick in that sense around, you know, you're not going to tolerate it yourself, so you'll speak up, which can, in fact, make you a target. But it's about, you know, despite all the research, despite all the studies, despite all the data, despite even the surveys within organisations that clearly indicate things are not working well, you know, there's the report that comes out, there's the motherhood kind of, yes, we're not going to tolerate this sort of stuff. And then everyone sort of just goes back to business as usual until the next situation arises. And, you know, this whole human behaviour stuff, it's just, we've got to a point now where we don't want people yelling at each other and putting pressure on others, no matter where we sit on the workplace chain or whatever. And, you know, for me personally, this has been a wonderful opportunity just to simply engage with this particular forum too, because, you know, there's that collaboration and connectivity that we do want things to be better for everybody, that we want safe workplaces, that we want, you know, people feeling that what they're contributing to, you know, is greater than the sum of whatever we're doing, you know, and we want to be happy. You know, we want to go to work, feel like we're doing a good job.
We spend 80% of our time working, you know, and we want
to. Thank you, Chris. And on that positive note, I have to intervene. I'm sorry because we've got a lot of other questions to get through.
Thank you.
Sorry to.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for sharing your experiences too, Chris. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Chris. Very good.
Thank you, Chris. Simon, just on a simple sort of data collection issue, what challenges do you face with?
It's the most challenging data collection ever. If I don't have wonderful collaborators and connections, none of these things would have happened.
And in terms of the incidence of abusive supervision, do you think that over time, with increasing research attention, the behavior is increased or decreased? I mean, it could go either way, right? I mean, the more we study it, the more.
So if you look at the literature, in fact, Ben actually had this paper, an integration of the research and abuse supervision has been summarized in the annual review of organizational psychology and organizational behavior. So if you're interested in this line of research, I would strongly encourage you to read his work, because that summarizes like what, 18 to 20 years of research on abuse supervision. I should say that a lot of the research questions have already been saturated. Okay,
Yeah.
and most of the research has predominantly focused on the back end of abuse supervision about the consequences, and there's very little work looking at the front end. But even having said that, this is now sort of a bandwagon. Everyone does research on abuse supervision now. That I think what we need now is to develop interventions. How can we mitigate this? Right. So my team and I from Minnesota, here in Illinois, and also in Australia, are developing these micro interventions in terms of like reaching out to supervisors who have the predisposition to engage in hostility. So I think a new wave of research now in abuse supervision should focus more on practical interventions. Okay, now we know the antecedents. Now we know what is the profile, the personality predictors, the characteristics, the attributes of abuse supervisors. We now know the moderators. We now know the mechanisms. We now know the consequences. What now? How do you change the behavior? I mean, Chris did mention this, okay? So I think the new trend now, this is the trend I would encourage if you're doing abuse supervision research, is focus on what specific interventions are useful, what specific interventions can actually modify the behavior and lead to behavior change.
Excellent.
Yeah,
Andrew has raised his
Andrew, go.
hand. Andrew, if you want to jump in there.
Hi, Andrew.
Good, Andrew. I think you just need to unmute.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. It's fantastic. Look, I do a lot of research in systemic organisational misconduct from a governance ethics perspective. So in a completely different silo of literature.
Sure.
So one of the things I just wanted to kind of highlight is that some of the evidence you're surfacing is consistent with some of the observations in the literature and areas that I've been interested in. So, for example, if you look at some of the evidence that came out of the Banking Royal Commission, but I do think that there are some huge tensions.
Yep.
In the sense that I think to be constructively critical, there are huge problems with OB's focus on psychological explanations.
Yes. That's
and
correct, Andrew. There are papers, for example, written by the way, I am in a school of labor and employment relations, right? And what I appreciate in this school is that it's a multidisciplinary school. So I have colleagues in IR, labor econ. I talk to them every day, and this is basically what we talk about. And despite the disciplinal differences in our department, I think what we actually highlight here is an appreciation for diversity of intellectual contributions.
Yeah, and look, I think, one of the things that I just wanted to quickly highlight, which doesn't tend to come up a lot in the OB literature, because it's not viewed as contemporary and de rigueur, so to speak, is that a lot of the evidence from the corporate governance, organisational misconduct, corporate criminology literature talks about actually, and this is the big tension that I just wanted to focus on, is this religious, almost fundamentalist emphasis on flattening out organisational structures opens up significant zones of secrecy and unaccountable discretion.
Yep.
And in fact, that is a significant driver to allow these people to actually exercise the kind of control and abuse that you explain. And I'm concerned that a lot of research in OB actually doesn't, because to talk about hierarchy and structure is seen as you actually highlighted in your presentation, it's seen, there's this idea that open structures actually facilitate better outcomes. I would dispute that. I'd actually argue that it's greater accountability, transparency, and structure can help with that. And a lot of the solutions you talk about and solutions in OB actually are too intra-organisationally focused, and there needs to be a lot more focus on external accountability to actually address some of these problems with people higher up the hierarchy that are unaccountable and don't face any consequences. And we've seen that with the Banking Royal Commission in Australia, where, for example...
By the way, Andrew, you've already laid down future research directions, right?
Yeah, and look, I mean, the last point is that, you know, again, it's quite interesting that some of the people that figured in that Royal Commission are suddenly popping up this week in the popular in the financial presses as getting new roles in other organisations in spite of the scrutiny they were put under at the Commission. So this is a huge problem, and I think personally that there should be a lot more crossover between disciplines to try and solve it.
Absolutely. So I'm currently working on a paper. It's currently under revision, and it's a review paper. Given my interest in abuse, is linking domestic violence, for example, in organizations. So in that paper, for example, in that review paper, we reviewed 180 articles across disciplines, right? Ranging from psychology, sociology, family studies, clinical psychology, counseling, feminism, gender studies. And I agree with your point that there is now this clamor among scholars towards interdisciplinary work, because simply focusing on your silo limits the methodological diversity, the methodological innovations, the precision of the theories that you use. It also limits the level of analysis that is being captured by your research question. So I completely agree with you. Like, looking at abuse supervision, it doesn't have to be just psychological. It doesn't have to be just individual based. It will have to capture multiple levels of analysis at the macro, at the societal level, at the macro level, at the meso level, and then at the individual level. Because whether we like it or not, all these levels of analysis actually interact with one another.
No, yeah, I think that's I think that's definitely the future. Hopefully that we can do more of that. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. No worries. And thank you for your feedback, Andrew. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Andrew. Thanks, Simon. Unfortunately, I have to start getting more selective with the questions. And if you've asked a question and we couldn't get to it, apologies for that. We're going to run out of time soon. One question that is appearing in front of me here, Simon, is about, abuse of supervision is based on an employee's subjective perception.
Yes.
And you made reference to the issue of attribution biases. What, based on your experience, can be done to deal with that, or what practical interventions can there be to address it?
Okay, so let me respond to that question from a theoretical research perspective and then from a practical perspective, right? So there are basically two camps in the abuse supervision community, right? There's one camp, I would not mention the name of my colleagues out of due respect to my senior colleagues, but they argue that abuse supervision, basically, as you know, it's highly perceptual and therefore will be influenced by hostile attribution bias. So in other words, from a research perspective, if you conduct research, you collect data on abuse supervision, you should be able to control statistically for the effect of hostile attribution bias, or say from negative affect or from neuroticism in predicting outcomes, right? Because abuse supervision, highly perceptual and subjective from the perspective of the subordinate, is actually influenced by people's cognitive biases, right? So that's one. So from a research perspective, that makes sense because there is now a recognition that these two are conflated and has to be controlled for in any analysis or any empirical analysis. So second point, because it's highly perceptual, you're right. It is possible that someone can just concoct a story that he or she has been abused, okay? And this usually happens, so when I do my consulting work, for example, this usually happens when you're doing a performance review and, for example, the subordinate is not really performing very well, and the subordinate is working with a supervisor on just the two of them talking about the performance review. And of course, it became emotional, it became heated debate, and then suddenly, you know, HR will receive like a letter of complaint against that supervisor, even if the abuse or the bullying did not actually take place, right? So there are practical strategies. So first, it's important that the situation will have to be documented. There should actually be witnesses who is willing to actually come forward, or not even come forward, perhaps verify the veracity of the complaint. Okay, this is from the perspective of the subordinate. So we call them third parties, right? From the perspective of the supervisor, it is essential that you also need to protect yourself from any of these complaints. So if you're actually doing a performance review with a subordinate, make sure that you have a coworker or a colleague who will sit down in the performance review. That person will not do anything. All that person does is to observe and take down notes, right? And it's imperative. I'm sure a lot of Australian organizations, Australian universities do this, is for before a supervisor will take on a supervisory role, it's imperative that these leaders or future leaders will have to go through supervisory training or leadership training.
Okay, we are pretty much out of time here, so I'm sorry for those of you who asked questions that we couldn't get to. Thank you for your participation. Thank you, Simon, for your time, and you know, stay warm and safe over there. So that's the final webinar in our Leadership Research Network's webinar series for this year. We hope you've enjoyed it. Herman's here as well, and perhaps Herman, you want to make a few comments about what things people can look forward to next year.
Hopefully, I may be able to visit Monash University, you know, once the borders have opened, right? Definitely. So I'm usually in Australia during my US summer, spend my time in Australia, working with my colleagues in different Australian universities between June to middle of August. So hopefully I'll be able to come and visit and see you guys. And
definitely.
Yeah, I just want to say, very quick to say a few words. Once again, this is a new seminar series that we have developed. We always want to engage, you know, colleagues, doctoral students, alumni, and the industry partners for different, you know, parts of the world, and to let you guys know that how our research has been able to influence policy, practices, and put in some sort of a practical implications. I think this is a very good showcase to all the effort of the colleagues have put in. On the other hand, in 2021, we will continue to invite, you know, all the good speakers coming to share, you know, their research, their expertise, and try to stimulate more discussions and, you know, proactive ideas that can help us to improve science, improve organizational practices, and also improve ourselves working in the organizations. I think that will be our goal and aim, to engage with, you know, colleagues from different places all over the world. Once again, thank you so much for your continuous support to the you know, Leadership Research Group and all the seminars that you guys have attended. You know, KK and I will always appreciate of all your support. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And before we go, I just want to give another shout out to Shahab and his team there. They're the ones that you receive the communications from, who do all the back end hard work on these events. And they do a tremendous job, and they should be recognized for that. So thank you, Shahab. He's sitting there back there in the
you show your face. We give you a big applause.
Let us see.
Well done. And our director, Ching Wu, is also here as well. Thank you so much for all the support as well.
And guys, again, thank you for the opportunity to actually speak in your seminar series. Much appreciated.